So what I wanted to do today was to talk a little bit about things you have to think about with regard to privacy and cybersecurity as you're creating a startup. But some of these ideas are broader than just startups. I mean, there's cybersecurity and privacy, and increasingly safety as it pertains to things like AI are becoming very relevant to tech in general. Just as a little bit of introduction, as Allison said, I work at a venture capital firm called DataTribe. We're based in the DC area, and we focus on very, very early stage investing, principally into cybersecurity startups. We're really set up to be a good fit to work with very tech heavy, deep tech type of startups. Many of our founders come out of the National Security Agency. We're just actually down the road from NSA in the DC area. But we also are very interested and excited to work with founders that come out of places like CMU. My own background, I've been through this startup process a few times, as Allison mentioned. I can say that in cybersecurity, it's truly never a boring day. There's always something new happening. So many of you may not have realized this. So this is the data and it's sort of broken out by state here. The different data elements that are encoded in the 2D barcode on the back of your driver's license. And so, when somebody scans a driver's license, they're oftentimes getting an enormous amount of data and this is something that I think many people don't necessarily realize. There's this great book by this guy Bruce Schneier called Data and Goliath. Highly recommended. And he has this quote in there. Mark Zuckerberg declared in 2010 that privacy is no longer a quote social norm, but bought 4 houses abutting his in Palo Alto to help ensure his own privacy. You fast forward about 9 years, and the tenor of the conversation has very much changed. Where you now have WhatsApp with end-to-end encryption, and Meta has positioned itself to be much more of a kind of, at least in terms of its marketing rhetoric, a privacy-oriented company. You have billboards that, so now Apple has always been an interesting example of one of the big tech companies that's really sought to, over the long term, position itself as differentiated by virtue of its strength with privacy, but it's becoming this increasingly kind of privacy is this point of differentiation. So cyber, you guys, I'm sure, read the news just like I do. Actually, toward the end of this year, and I don't know if you were paying attention to it, there was an incredible story about this thing called Salt Typhoon. Now, Salt Typhoon is a threat group that's in China that has, basically been, sort of compromising and breaching the major telcos in the United States, but also other countries. And this is, literally just like within the last month or so, to the point where the US government was actually advising senior government officials to not use their mobile phones for important phone calls and texting. So like if they needed to do something, to do it on an end-to-end encrypted app like WhatsApp. That's kind of astonishing when you have the government saying, don't use your mobile phone. Now that's something that happened within just like the last month. Big breaches are happening all the time. This cyber sort of activity is a daily occurrence, but there's in 2024 alone, there were a number of really big ones. Like, for example, a company called Change Healthcare, which is a subsidiary of United Health Insurance, which actually processes about 40% of the medical claims in the United States, was taken offline by a ransomware attack. And it taken offline for weeks, and it caused hospitals and doctors' offices and other medical providers to basically have to go to pen and paper. And actually, many medical practices actually went out of business because they could not file their medical claims and get paid. And that was another example of a big breach that happened this year. Snowflake, the big data management company, got breached, and it lost data for many of its customers. I think end users were like 50 million were affected. It was very, very significant. So point is that cyber breaches are happening more and more over time, and the magnitude of them is getting bigger and bigger. One thing many people don't know in tech in general, and just something to be aware of is, and I call this the sort of the hacking industrial complex. So basically, if you guys are probably maybe a little on the young side to know about this, but so this guy Bizarro is like the opposite of Superman, and so in the DC universe, there's he has all the kind of converse superpowers of Superman. There is this sort of opposite to the tech world ecosystem, and it's heavily populated by nation states. And so you think places like NSA, but then countries have their counterparts to NSA. So in England, it's GCHQ. And so every country right now has a cyber espionage, which is like cyber spying and cyber warfare units. One of the things that these units do is they have on staff, these are people that get paychecks and are collecting pensions and things. They have paycheck collecting offensive hackers that basically work to find vulnerabilities in all of the different tech products that we use on a day-to-day basis in order to create advantage in the digital sort of realm for their respective national interests. So when people say a cyber weapon, so a cyber weapon is a kind of abstract concept. What a cyber weapon is for real is it's a technique, it's a hack, it's an exploit, it's a way of getting into a technology, a system, a mobile phone, a laptop, you name it. And if you don't tell the manufacturer, so say you figure out how to get into an iPhone, and you don't tell Apple about that, you can kind of keep that technique in your back pocket and use it when you might need it. That's a cyber weapon. And countries are creating cyber weapons all the time. So when if you guys are doing software development and you're checking your code in and you're thinking, just think about the fact in your back of your mind that it might not just be criminals or kids in the basement that are kind of playing around. It's actually very sophisticated nation states that are oftentimes doing the hacking to try and find vulnerabilities in your systems. So just the landscape is very interesting. As you're building your startup, you're building your reputation. And great quote by Warren Buffett is just a reminder that it takes a long time to build up a reputation, but you can lose it very quickly. And so something to kind of keep in mind. So I'm going to go over all of that was just a little bit of warm up. So what I'm going to talk about right here is just really quickly go through like some big picture ideas. We'll talk about some startup axioms, just so if you guys are thinking about, kind of doing a startup, some basic rules of thumb. We'll talk a little bit about privacy and security. They are complementary. They're not the same thing. And then we'll just leave it open for some questions at the end. By show of hands, are you all, like, who all here is interested in startups, potentially like doing a startup or is actively in a startup? Okay, cool. That's almost everybody in the room. Very cool. So big picture, this sort of block represents data or information, and in a lot of cases, information is the so-called cheese that people are after. Now, there are types of hacking incidents where they're not actually after data; they're actually out to operationally disrupt you. So, a ransomware attack against a hospital, which happens all the time, is very much an operational disruption where you basically are holding a hospital ransom, saying, "Look, if you don't pay this ransom, then you cannot operate your digital systems, and therefore we're going to disrupt your operation and maybe impair your ability to deliver healthcare to patients." Same thing. So MGM, the big hotel chain and casino chain, last year had a breach that took the entire chain of hotels offline. I mean, including like being able to get into your room with the key card and like the slot machines and everything. It was like a big mess for like a week. And that was a similar like operational disruption. Around your information here, you're building up defenses. And so security is really the integrity of those defenses, right? I mean, kind of begging the obvious here. And so the question is how does this all apply to startups? Because there's a really key thing to keep in mind is that as you're trying to get off the ground with a new product, that's hard. It's just not easy. And ultimately, if the new product doesn't succeed, like if you don't succeed in the market, then all the security and privacy questions are moot. They don't really matter. So it's important to kind of balance things with regard to your stage and balance it with regard to the level of risk at hand. And so a couple just quick startup axioms. If you are just, these are broader than security and privacy. So first thing is your superpower as a startup, and the thing that gives you the ability to win over even much, much bigger incumbent companies is focus. And so you have to be really, really attentive to making sure that you maintain a very tight focus on your product and on your strategy and what you're doing. Now, that's a long conversation. You could go on, but that's just one key startup axiom. Another axiom, and it kind of circles back to what I was saying before, is stage appropriateness. And so you can have 5-star restaurant level security or 1-star restaurant level security. You have to pick the number of stars that's appropriate for the risk and where you are in your business journey, and that's really important. The same thing goes for other things as you're building out your startup. So, for example, the level of sophistication in your bookkeeping, the level of sophistication in even in things as central as maybe like your technical architecture. Like you might cut corners to go fast deliberately at the beginning of your startup journey, but you have to, and that's a stage appropriate thing to do, but you have to be prepared and eyes open to the fact that you might need to later, when you need scalability or when you need greater integrity in the system, go back and then sort of take those corners you cut and then fill them back in. So that's a really important kind of axiom with regard to startups. Another key thing just to keep in mind as you guys are working on startups is it is really, really good idea to find trustworthy trail guides early in your journey. So if you are thinking about privacy and security, if some of the things I talk about today resonate with you, or if you think that they're relevant to your path, then you might want to find somebody that comes from the industry, knows things in the industry, is connected to the industry to help advise you on those matters. The same thing goes really for a couple key areas. In your kind of startup world, as you're getting going, finding a good accountant and finding a good attorney that are not like ridiculously overpriced, but can be helpful guides for you are also very important, because there are a lot of kind of relatively straightforward decisions that you make in the kind of formation of a startup and getting things going, where if you choose one thing over the other, it can have a big consequence later. But in the beginning, it's easy to sometimes step into a crack without knowing it, without that right guidance. And so you want to find good trail guides early. All right. So privacy is, if you think about shades on a window, there is sort of how well you can kind of shield your information from those that you want to see it versus those that you don't want to see it, and then your ability to do that is actually your security. And so in 2018, we went through this kind of sea change with regard to data privacy, and it had been sort of in the works for a long time prior to 2018, but 2018 was the year that this big European law called the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, came out. And GDPR really established and this is a regulation that only affects EU citizens, but because many tech companies don't want to have to maintain multiple versions of their system for EU citizens versus people in other countries, it's sort of effectively had impacts in other places as well. that was really the change. Prior to that, and you could even in those quotes at the beginning, there was this real change in sentiment about data privacy between like 2010-ish and 2020-ish. And this example of OneTrust is a company. It's just an interesting case example of a company that started in 2016 and grew like wildfire. They have over 2,000 employees, and they raised money a couple years ago at like a $5 billion, $4 billion valuation. A company grew like a weed. And what OneTrust does, and there's a handful of others, is that they provide enterprise tools to big companies to help them manage all of the complexity involved with data privacy rules for handling the data of their customers. Prior to this point in 2018, it was really Wild West. Like companies would just they would sort of save data, scarf away data, all kinds of data on people, and they really didn't worry too much about organizing it, classifying it, identifying sensitive parts to it. And it was really with that passing of that European regulation, and then there's others that have been sort of derivative of it that have come out in the United States. Like there's a thing called CCPA in California. A number of other states in the United States have privacy rules. The change architecturally and from a data management perspective really introduced this challenge to companies of, oh, you've been saving terabytes and terabytes of data for the last, however many decades and not worrying about organizing it now. Actually, certain elements of data are subject to certain rules and regulations, and you have to identify where those elements are, and you have to organize it and be able to put them under management. And that has created a significant change in the data management kind of domain in general. So nothing here you don't know, but I mean, basically, as everything is becoming digital, and as kind of cloud computing has enabled even, this, you could have one individual, whether that person is a startup founder or potentially an adversary, a hacker, can marshal the level of compute through things like Azure and AWS that used to be only the largest companies could have. And so it's very easy for people to basically aggregate huge amounts of data, even if it's just an individual. There's numerous laws and rules. So GDPR and CCPR too, we mentioned, but there's many others. Certainly AI is very topical, and I'm sure you guys are thinking a lot about it, and as the whole world. And one thing that I've come to really appreciate in the cybersecurity world, particularly when you start to talk to people that come out of the nation state cyber environment, so places like NSA, there really is no such thing as a 100% secure system. I mean, it's all a kind of spectrum of risk. And if there's a system that a very sophisticated actor really wants to get into, it's probably they're going to get into it. And that's something that's also important to keep in mind. So this is just some general kind of context. So just some trends, and these are things. It's a busy slide. There's a lot of stuff on here. The purpose of this is to kind of give you a little bit of a lay of the land of the types of regulations and trends that are sort of in play as it pertains to, in particular, privacy. So there are a number of, and this has some European laws on it, heavy U.S. slant. But these different laws, and you can look them up in ChatGPT and Google it, whatever. But there's a long list of different regulations that stipulate how data is managed. Now, what does that mean for you when you're creating a startup? What it means for you as you're creating a startup is that you have to be conscious of sensitive data, and there are certain patterns here. It's not like you have to master necessarily every one of these laws, and at some point, if your company is very successful and it gets very large, you would have a compliance team that would know the details, and one of your trail guides, an outside attorney that would be able to help you with these things. But in the early days of your startup, it's just important to know that there are these laws out there, and that there are certain data elements that are considered to be more sensitive. And those data elements tend to be things that are identity-oriented elements, PII is the acronym, personally identifiable information. So usually it's the combination of a name and an email address, or a name and a driver's license number, a name and a social security number. If your system for some reason is taking custody of these types of data elements, you want to make sure that you're paying close attention to how you're managing that data. You want to pay close attention to not necessarily just say, no, I don't want to have it, but you just want to be conscious of the fact that you're actually taking on some additional potential risk with those data elements. So the first bullet there, the state level data breach laws. So those laws actually came into effect, I don't know, probably about 15 years ago, they started coming into effect. And every state in the United States has, and in other countries as well, has regulations that basically say, hey, if you're breached, you have to let the data subjects, so we are all data subjects, you have to let the data subjects know that you were breached. And that can be very expensive. And so, we've all at this point received those notifications from some provider, like, hey, we had an incident. We're going to give you a free year of credit monitoring. And it's almost become cliche at this point. But it's very expensive. If you have a situation where your system is breached, and you need to comply with those regulations, it can snowball very quickly. So one of the big advantages, and this is a green field in case, so one of the big advantages of startups is, in addition to being super agile and being able to have very, very sort of narrow focus, is that you are working from a green field. Like, you don't have a ton of legacy. You aren't a giant company that's been scarfing away data for the last 20 years and has to kind of retroactively put Band-Aids on all of this legacy in order to accommodate new rules that have come out. And so this is really important. It's a big advantage, and it's something to kind of keep in mind as you're sort of thinking about these things. So kind of making sense of all this stuff. Because I've just kind of been giving you, all right, there's a lot of cyber, there's no system that's safe, there's a lot of laws, okay, it's complicated for sure. How do you make sense of it with regard to a startup? First of all, stage appropriate. You want to invest the amount that's appropriate for the stage where you are. Having some education and knowledge of these things is just in your back pocket, knowing at some point you might need to Google, GDPR, let me read more about that. At least I'm aware of what's out there. You generally want to minimize the amount of data you collect. So data minimization is this term for, and what that does is it keeps your data attack surface as small as conceivably possible. So you may decide you want to collect up a certain data element from people. And so if you have a healthcare app, for example, certain clinical data is going to be subject to HIPAA, which is the kind of healthcare privacy law. You may need to have certain healthcare data in order to deliver the value proposition for the customer. That's fine. But it's just eyes open, knowing I'm doing this. I need to make sure I'm extra careful with how I encrypt that data. I'm extra careful with how I manage that data. But if it's necessary, but you wouldn't, if there's additional data that maybe is nice to have, maybe I'll use it in the future, but I don't know if I need it right now. You might want to think twice about collecting that. That's a very different risk calculation than what people used to do a few years back, where the risk calculation a few years ago was, hey, I don't know if I'll ever need that data, but what the hell, hard drives are cheap. Let's just collect all the data we can. So as I just mentioned, handle sensitive data with care. You want to carefully evaluate your privacy trade-offs. Like I just said, basically, there's nothing wrong with taking a risk with regard to this type of data. You just want to be eyes open to it, and make sure that it's that you feel like the payoff for whatever additional sort of risk you might be taking is actually worth it. You want to be as diligent as you can in terms of actually the security around those key data elements. Oops, sorry. Yeah. And so this is kind of, at the high level, sort of bubbling up some of the detail about the risks. So just a few key concepts, and so this is from the California privacy law, CCPA. So just certain things that data subjects have. They have a right to access data. So if you don't know what you've collected about people, that's really hard to do. Like if I've been collecting data about people and haven't organized it in a way where I myself can't even tell you what I know about you, that's a big thing. So thinking about, okay, well, if I am collecting data about people, knowing that someday I might need to provide those data subjects with the information, or at least a list of the information we have about them, that might inform the way you think about the architecture. Right to deletion. So again, if I don't even know what data I have on you, I can't, it's very hard for me to be able to guarantee I've deleted it. Knowing the purpose and having the ability to right to opt out to those data elements. These are some of the key concepts. Now you can look further into CCPA, but conceptually these concepts are kind of parallel to some of the other privacy regulations at the state level, as well as GDPR. So again, thematically, this is sort of the type of thing you want to be thinking about as you're sort of saying, okay, I could design my my data storage in one way or another way. I'll do it this way so I can at least future-proof myself with regard to these potential future requirements. So there's this organization, IAP, which is it's the largest international association of privacy professionals, and it has like, I think there's probably like 120,000 members in it worldwide. It's a pretty big organization. They have a comprehensive tracker of the different types of U.S. state level laws. So you can, and the URL is right there on the bottom. I mean, you can go in and kind of check this out to get a little bit more high fidelity picture of the types of different obligations that data custodians have, and how they're manifest in different states. As well, the law firm Baker Hostetler also has a nice sort of outline of the different state-by-state data breach laws, and you can see here how the definition of personal information is actually very key, because it's that definition of personal information which will actually trigger whether a data breach law has actually been tripped. So if you don't lose, say your system is breached and you don't lose these data elements, then you may not have anything to worry about with regard to those data breach laws. And so there's toxic data is the term I use for these types of high risk data elements. And whenever I'm working on thinking about a system, I like to try to minimize having any of those toxic data elements in the system as possible. All right, so that was a little bit about the kind of privacy landscape. Admittedly, very quick at a very high level, but the point is to basically give you a bit of perspective on the fact that over the course of the last 10, 15 years, the industry has really gone through this big sea change in kind of mindset and attitude around privacy, and how it's being manifest through different regulations at state level, national level, international level, and that there's something there that you have to pay attention to. And conceptually, most of it has to do with, oh my gosh, there's sensitive data about somebody. I need to make sure that I'm paying attention to that and that I'm managing that risk in proportion to where I am with my startup, kind of stage appropriate. Now, let's talk a little bit about the lock itself. How many of you guys know, like, have any of you guys work in cyber or come out of cyber security? Okay, so we got two people okay, so know stuff about cybersecurity. Cyber, it's fast-paced, it's jargon-filled, and it's pretty technical. And the reason it's technical in some ways is because to kind of defend systems, you need to kind of know them soup to nuts, because adversaries can attack a system from anywhere from the network to the firmware, to the hardware, to the software at all different levels in the stack. I mean, and so it starts to get very technical. There's also just a lot of jargon in general in the industry, so it can be easy to feel confused or sort of overwhelmed by it. Another reason it can feel overwhelming is that there's a lot of vendors. So cybersecurity has been growing at basically the pace of digitalization. So if you think about how, everything is becoming digital, right? So like we now have, self-driving cars. Has anybody here, have you guys driven in a Waymo out in San Francisco? Or so we got some nods. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of amazing. Like you go out to San Francisco and like a third of the cars on the road are like, there's no driver. I mean, like a full third, and they're going like, 40 miles an hour, and like people walk in front of them in the crosswalk and don't think twice. I mean, it's amazing. Digitalization is happening. Software is eating the world. And as that's happening, so is cybersecurity. This is just a map. It's actually it's a couple years old, but it's a map that kind of illustrates just the magnitude of the industry. These companies here are actually larger companies. I mean, most of the ones on this have already probably advanced to somewhere between, say north of $10 million of revenue, and have raised venture capital and so on. There's multiple thousands of venture-backed cybersecurity startups, and they have a lot of different focused specializations. So it's this very vast domain to kind of get your head around. So in an attempt to kind of sort of simplify this, let's just sort of boil it down and kind of simplify it down a little bit. Like soccer or football, basketball, whatever sport you want to say, there's offense and there's defense. And then there's basically, give or take, three levels of sophistication. There's, nation states, there's kind of companies and criminals, and then there's essentially kids in the basement that are just like playing around. All right, that's a sort of the three levels of sophistication. And what happens is that the most sophisticated stuff, the bleeding edge in cyber, is oftentimes on the offensive side at the nation state level. And offensive nation state hacking is probably thinking about stuff that the rest of the world probably won't catch up to for a couple of years, right? Now, if you think about big companies like, Google or Meta, Uber, or Amazon, big tech companies, very, very savvy engineers. But those engineers, and this is really important, those engineers by and large play defense. They don't go offensive. Like you don't have AWS offensively hacking, some other, like that just doesn't happen. And what happens over time is that you just develop different, much like a sport, you develop very different muscles and very different specialization. And so this is a kind of good way of thinking about cyber and just kind of boiling it down and simplifying it. So in terms of a startup, what you want to do is, I would say, is you want to focus on doing the basics well, and then invest where there's risk. And so the reason there's so many different cybersecurity companies, in part at that slide at the beginning, is because whenever there's a new threat, a new attack vector, oftentimes there's almost a new market opportunity. So for example, artificial intelligence is kind of really accelerated in the last couple of years. And now AI models represent their own attack surface. So I can attack AI models, but they also can be used as defensive technology. AI models introduce whole new opportunities. And in that logoscape I just showed you before, like that will create a whole other 10 or 20 companies. That happens over and over in cyber, where some new thing comes out. So for example, just a few years ago, power plants and other operational technology facilities started connecting more and more of their physical plant to digital networks in order to make them easier to maintain. Well, all of a sudden, that created a whole new type of attack surface that also created a whole new landscape of cybersecurity firms. You want to basically focus, though, where basically there's risk for you in your startup. And so if you think that this is the crown jewel in terms of the data, or the crown jewel in terms of the operational stability of your company, that's where you really want to focus your energy. This is a handbook that has 5 very simple things. I like it quite a bit. It's from the Belfer Center at Harvard. And it's basically very, for a small organization that doesn't have a huge budget, that, won't necessarily be buying, all the different products that are on that big logoscape, some basic kind of hygiene, some basic cyber practices that will dramatically improve your cybersecurity. One of them is just making sure that you and your colleagues are aware of cyber risk. So there's a really big difference, in a company that has teams that are savvy and more aware of the different threats that are up against them. And so one of the there's really two ways at the end of the day that systems get breached. One of them is that, and this is probably 65+% of the time, is people are social engineered. They're tricked into clicking on something. So phishing attacks and stuff like that. The other way is basically vulnerability in the software. So there's some bug and some adversary has figured out how to use that bug to gain access or to make the system do something it wasn't designed to do. Those are the two basic ways at the end of the day that systems get hacked. If you can greatly inoculate yourself against the 65% if you make sure that everybody on your team is very aware of these risks and thus reduces the chances, hopefully, of things like a social engineering attack. You do want to use the cloud, and again, this might seem obvious. It for a long time wasn't obvious. There are a lot of. This literally took it took probably about 10 years for CIOs in big companies to get comfortable with the idea that putting their data in the cloud was the right way to go. That said, using the cloud is also a very broad term. Like using the cloud could be using a software as a service application, or it could be using something like AWS or Azure. One of the ways that many breaches and data essentially data sort of misconfigurations have created a huge number of incidents just because people have set up their clouds incorrectly. Big picture, though, it is the way to go because the large vendors like Google, like Salesforce, et cetera, they have the resources to really defend their systems at a tier 1 level, and using their technology and their platforms kind of enables you to get access to that level of sophisticated defenses. And so rule 2. Again, this is something I hope this is old hat to all you guys. You want to have multi-factor authentication, 2FA on all of the things that, like, on everything, but particularly on the most important accounts, like your email accounts, your accounts where you have sort of servers and administrative accounts. 2FA, very, very important on all your key accounts. You want to make sure that you're using encrypted communications for sensitive comms. And so definitely, it's very tempting sometimes for people to just send some sensitive information over a text or over email. Those are not encrypted. And you want to make sure that you're using the appropriate encrypted communication channels. And it could be just using Dropbox or something like that in terms of being able, in terms of transferring data or files that has sensitive information in it. And then you want to basically plan and prepare. I mean, you want to really think about this and have, in essence, at least have stepped through a bit of a kind of scenario where you've thought through, okay, if I did get breached, if the system was taken offline, what would be the contingency? These are 5 simple steps. This is not some sort of super sophisticated Fortune 500 security program. This would be the basics that you would want to make sure you have in place if you're kind of diligently creating some level of cyber protection that's kind of in line with your stage appropriateness or your stage as a startup. One thing to say that's important is that it's a process, and it's not something that you just do overnight. So security is something that can take a while, and it's an ongoing process. And so you want to make sure that you don't, because it is easy sometimes to feel overwhelmed by all the different systems and all the different updates and all the different things you could be doing. But if you do kind of one piece at a time, you really can materially improve your security posture. And it's important to just kind of keep that in mind and not become kind of discouraged by by the fact that it is an ongoing process. So a few other things to keep in mind. As you're building your software, there is a thing. So I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with software supply chain security at all? Okay, so I got one person here. Okay, cool. So yeah, so one of the ways that adversaries have figured out how to get into systems and is basically by compromising open source components. And so you really have to be mindful of when you grab an open source component off of GitHub or something, you want to start using that for your own system. You want to be really mindful that you are not pulling in vulnerabilities that have been put in there. And so there are tools for, Sonatype and SNCC are tools for helping you to do that. OWASP is an organization that has a list of their top 10 vulnerabilities. And so one of the big movements in cybersecurity in the last few years has been encouraging software teams to be more thoughtful in how they are incorporating security practices into their software development itself. And so so-called shifting left. And so OWASP has a list of 10 of the most common software vulnerabilities that the developers will oftentimes implement by accident. They've created other top 10 lists for things like AI and other related technology areas as well. And so, you guys are familiar with DevOps. There's this kind of term that's become very popular in the last few years, DevSecOps, where you basically are promoting the idea of security all the way up with development and ops in the process. You want to be aware of your third-party risk, and so this is, as you're selecting tools to use and work with in your startup, you might be using different CRM tools, different development tools. You just want to be thoughtful about, are those tools themselves secure, particularly if you're depending upon them for sensitive data. You want to be thoughtful about, if you're implementing an API integration to a third-party tool, that you're doing that in a way that is also secure and is appropriately encrypting identity information, et cetera, as you're establishing those API linkages. You may enter contracts with customers where they will hold you accountable for a breach, and this is something also to be aware of. So this is a trend that kind of became a little bit more common a few years back, where data breach indemnities and basically pushing the risk for a data breach onto you as a vendor has become something that's a bit more common. Something to pay attention to if you're doing business, particularly with larger companies. As a startup, you create a technology and you go to PNC Bank to sell it to them, and just there could be some additional things that you want to pay attention to in the contracts there. So there's definitely regulatory motion, and a lot of this, honestly, is going to be potentially shifting with the new administration coming into office. But there's interesting trends that are kind of happening, and just again, something to be aware of. One of them is that in the National Cybersecurity Strategy, and this is actually a concept that predated it, there's been this idea of shifting the liability for insecure software products to the vendor. So you guys might be aware, like if you ever look at the rules, or not the rules, excuse me, the terms and conditions in a software agreement, usually in like all caps, the software vendor is disclaiming liability for using their software. And this is the way software has been sold since the very beginning. And there's reasons for it. It kind of ties historically to the fact that it's very hard to guarantee software will work in different environments due to compatibility issues, et cetera. But increasingly people are starting to look at that risk sharing between the customer and the vendor and feeling that it's not entirely balanced appropriately. And there's a push at like the sort of national, at the White House level, to sort of adjust the relationship there. This is something to watch. I think it's an interesting trend. There's another thing that came out actually also in 2023 where so CISA, which stands for the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, it's a very awkward name, but it's part of DHS, and it's sort of the National Cyber Defense Organization in the U.S. They created a attestation form where basically software vendors that wanted to sell software to the government, U.S. government, would have to attest to the fact that their software was developed in line with like 35 very specific best practices that were established by NIST. So NIST has this thing called the Secure Software Development Framework, and it has a bunch of best practices for how to develop secure software securely. I've been part of a number of different product development efforts, and when I looked at that attestation form, I would not have wanted to been the executive that signed on the bottom line saying, I swear that this, all these things have been done. It's complicated and something that I think only people that are actually in the process of building the software would be very able to have visibility into the compliance with all those controls. There are companies, in fact, one of the companies that we, DataTribe, invested in is actually a company that builds tooling to make that type of process of attesting to your software development practices easier. Big picture, out there on the horizon, there are sort of forces at play where there's going to be increased scrutiny and increased pressure on making sure that as you're creating your products, that you're doing it in a secure way. So there's some frameworks to know about. NIST has a cybersecurity framework. It's a good reference. There's also a thing called SOC, which is, so you might have heard of a SOC 2. A SOC 2 is a cybersecurity controls framework where if I'm, like say I'm about to buy some, software as a service accounting package, I want to know how that company manages my data. So SOC is a set of controls. And if you, and it's something that increasingly startups are doing SOC certifications earlier and earlier because companies are asking, hey, are you SOC certified? And basically what you go through this big long list of controls, you make sure that you're compliant with those controls, you hire a third-party auditor. Those third-party audits can cost $10,000, $20,000, $30,000. You get the audit, you get the report, and then you could say to your prospective customers, yes, I am SOC 2 certified. It's just something to know about, but it's not, people like to say compliance is not security, and it is true, but in a lot of ways, compliance is better than nothing. And so the exercise of actually going through that, it's not something you do day one, but we've been seeing startups doing SOC certifications, particularly if they have products that they're selling to enterprise customers. If you have products that you're selling to enterprise customers, we have startups that are even, like less than $1 million of revenue that are going ahead and doing their SOC certifications. So something to know about. Cyber risk insurance is another area that is continued. Some customers may ask for it. It's something to be aware of. And you at some point may just want to buy a cybersecurity risk policy that additionally helps. In the event that you had some sort of cyber event, there's a insurance policy that can help pay for all those notification notices that you have to send out to your customers and things like that. So just staying up to date. Now, I'm highly biased here because this is one of our portfolio companies, so CyberWire. But I'm like legitimately, it is I think the best daily podcast for cyber. So the CyberWire Daily is NPR quality, 25-minute scripted, cybersecurity daily podcast, extremely high quality. CSO Perspectives is the former CSO from Palo Alto Networks. This guy, Rick Howard, does an awesome overview of how chief security officers and CISOs think about security. And then Cyber Law and Policy podcast Caveat is a attorney that attorney and the host, again, weekly. It's tremendous coverage of privacy and regulatory matters, and you can get these things also in email as well. So also from Bruce Schneier, Data and Goliath, complexity is the worst enemy of security, and so a big part of this is understanding, kind of going in and understanding the complexity of the landscape, but then boiling it down and simplifying it and making it stage appropriate for a startup, and making sure that you're really investing, you're very clear-eyed, where are my crown jewels at this point in my startup journey, and that you're appropriately investing your efforts around those crown jewels. That's all I had. We've got probably a few minutes if there's any questions. I appreciate you guys staying with me. Any questions? No question? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think so. The question for folks online, the question was, what other forms of compliance would you recommend? Yeah, I mean, I think SOC 2, Type 2 is one. ISO is another one that people often look at. I think probably, my opinion, one at that stage is probably enough, and I would go with SOC. I think that's probably the main one. I mean, honestly, I don't know if there's others that you would have to. And there's companies, there's a landscape of companies. So a couple of the names are Vanta, Vanta, Drata. So there's a couple of startups that have basically created platforms for managing the process of getting these compliance requirements in place. And those, a number of our companies that have been doing those types of compliance projects have found those products to be very useful. Yeah.
Just want to thank you for your speech. It was very good, very well presented. You were a good orator. I think it was like excellent for like startup crowd. My one question is, do you have a list of companies within your portfolio that you work with, or is it like confidential for you guys only?
Oh, sure. No, I mean, it's so the companies in our portfolio are on our website. So if you go to datatribe.com, they're there.
What's like the size?
The companies that we work with. Yeah, so we typically invest in companies that are, so we're from inception through seed. So we will invest as early as an individual with a PowerPoint presentation, and we do it in a way that's unusual. So where we're unusual is most venture capitalists will invest at that stage with a relatively small check. We'll invest $2.5 million into a company that's just pre-product, an idea and a founder. If we have conviction about the direction of the business, and we have conviction about the founding team, and then we will invest up to, at the other end, probably the most mature company that we've invested in probably had about $1 million to $1.5 million in annual recurring revenue when we made the investment. That's sort of the range. Most of the time, probably half the time or a little bit more, we're investing in companies where there's a prototype maybe, and usually it's pre-revenue, so really early in stage. Now, we've been doing this since 2016. We have 20 portfolio companies now, and the companies at this stage have kind of different, all over the map in terms of maturity. So the most mature company that's in our portfolio is a company that has grown to be past, Series E. They raised, they're like unicorn valuation. They raised at a north of $1 billion valuation about a year ago. Have probably about 600 employees, things like that. So that's the most mature. We have companies that are at the 100 employee stage, in the $20 to $50 million kind of revenue range, and then we have companies that are earlier as well. But when we make the investment is typically at that very, very early stage.
And where's the concentration of most applicants? Are they like East Coast based, or is it across?
So yeah, so we are we get opportunities presented to us from founders all around the country. We do get a fair amount from you know from the Bay Area, but also a lot from the East Coast. We ourselves are based in just down the road from NSA by design in Maryland, so in the DC area, about halfway between Baltimore and Washington DC. And out of our founders, probably about half of our founders have some connection to the NSA or the CIA. So they've come out of that community. And then the rest of the founders have different backgrounds, either through places, deep research labs, or universities like a CMU or with deep commercial background. And we have some geographic preference in that we think that we're able to work most effectively and help the most, AKA add value in air quotes, if the companies are closer to us. That said, we have a number of companies that have been quite successful that are either completely virtual or are remote. But I think probably 60% of our companies are local. Now we have a facility where if the companies, because we're investing so early, oftentimes the companies don't have any physical presence or place to work. If they need a place to work, they can use our facility. And we currently have 3 companies working out of our facility in Maryland.